Hello, YouTubers, and welcome back to Go Figure Customs YouTube channel. It's been a while since I put out kind of anything. I use the channel primarily for uh, General Geekery podcast with my best friend and co-host JD, and I also put out solo content for um, tutorials on customizing action figures and making card backs and pretty much anything that goes along with custom action figure creation. Uh, but what really got me a lot of subscribers in the past has been my toy reviews. And it's been a long time since I've done a solo toy review. And I think that's because it's been a long time since something interesting has come out that has made me want to do a solo toy review. And that happened recently with the new Visionaries figures from Super7. Of course, I am a huge vintage toy collector and customizer and aficionado. I grew up in the 80s, and that was the golden age of action figures. I mean, it really was. The endless aisles of full pegs that were not the same, all of the same figures. It just, I think back to those days, and man, I miss those, being able to go to the store and find all of the new G.I. Joe guys when the new wave came out, and seeing all the other toys that tried to compete with those big names back in the 80s, like Mask and Centurions and Spiral Zone, and of course, Visionaries. Visionaries came out, was one wave in 1987, and it was a wave of four bad guys, which were called Darkling Lords, and a wave of, in the same wave, were four good guys, which were the Spectral Knights, and then each faction had two vehicle drivers, for a total of 12 figures. There was a cartoon to go along with it. It lasted 13 episodes. There was also a Marvel Comics adaptation that was published by Star Comics, which was kind of the children's comic line as part of Marvel. Uh, it lasted 6 issues, I think, if I remember correctly, although the UK edition went up to 13, if I'm not mistaken. Um, and then I think I heard that there was an IDW attempt at a Visionaries that didn't last very long either. I haven't seen that, so I'm not really familiar with that one. But anybody that's not familiar with Visionaries, the premise of that, I find it really interesting, and that it hits harder today than it did in the 80s. And that is, these are a group of people that live on this technically advanced planet. I mean, they had like space travel and that kind of, they were very technically dependent. But the problem was that they had three suns, and every 7,000 years, those three suns would align, which would essentially create an EMP, and it destroyed all of their technology in one day. And back in the 80s, yeah, okay, that's a pretty interesting premise. But today, as dependent as we are on technology, I'm recording this on my phone. It's not a phone, it's a computer that takes calls. I mean, as heavily technologically integrated as we are these days, if something like that happened to us, we literally would go back to the Stone Age, and a lot of people would die, unfortunately. And that's pretty much what happened on this planet called Prismos. The saving grace was that there was an age of magic prior to the age of technology. And so this is like the second age of magic. And the good guys and bad guys fight for power from that's being gifted to them from this wizard named Merklin, which kind of sounds like Merlin from the Arthur legends. Um, and they get this, so magic takes over. So they have vehicles, but they're magic powered. They have weapons, but they're magic powered. They're imbued with a animal totem in the hologram on their chests, on the figures, which they can transform into magically. And the non-vehicle drivers each get a staff with a totem in it that has a dual hologram, and with a they can speak a spell, and it will give them a specific magic power for a short duration. The caveat to that is those staffs have to be recharged at the like secret fortress where Merklin resides, and they call that the Iron Mountain, if I remember correctly. So the premise is very interesting. I mean, I'm really surprised I didn't get into this as a kid. I don't think I'm just sure I never saw the cartoon as a kid. The cartoon is available on YouTube. I can probably put a link to a good place to watch it. It's like I said, it's 13 episodes. They're very well done. There's because it's done with it was done through Sunbow, which was the studio that was doing Transformers and GI Joe at the time. So there are voices that you will recognize if you watch the Visionaries cartoon. It's like, oh, I know who that is. Um, it's voices that you'll know. So the cartoon was done very well. There's continuity in the cartoon, so things that happen in a cartoon have repercussions later on. I mean, for 13 episodes, they did a fantastic job. And there was a second wave planned. Uh, I think it was at least 12 figures. I've looked, and I've looked at all of the figures that were planned, and they look really cool. And there were 4 more vehicles planned too. I think at least 4 more vehicles planned. Um, as an aside, someone did a Kickstarter for a book that goes over all of this stuff, and I have the PDF of that. That is free to share. So if you're interested in that, I'm probably going to put the PDF in my G drive that's accessible to the public. That's where I have all of my templates for my custom card backs that I let people use. So I'm probably going to put that PDF there. If anybody's interested, I will put a link to that too in the show notes. So take a look at that. But there was a whole second wave of figures planned, and figures and vehicles planned. So what happened? It's 1987. GI Joe is at the height of its popularity. I mean, that's the year that the Defiant came out. Some of the most recognizable characters in GI Joe came out in 86, 87, 88, and that was the year that Thundercats launched, and that was huge. So I mean, they're fighting for the shelf space, and the price point on these figures, I don't remember what the retail price on these was, but it was significantly more than what a GI Joe figure cost. And that was because of the hologram technology. And these weren't shitty holograms. They were nice holograms. So they've got a small one that's clipped into the chest, and then the hologram in the staff is a 2-image hologram. So the technology at that, for mid 80s at that time, I mean, I don't even know what it would cost to do today, but it could not have been cheap then. So the fact that they couldn't get a toehold in the cartoon, didn't get a second season, and that was kind of the shitty thing, is there's no resolution to that cartoon. It just ends. They just canceled it. But the competition and the price is what prevented this line from going on. Luckily, there are any number of toy companies these days that are working on doing updates of retro toys. Ramen Toys is a good example of that. The Loyal Subjects is a huge example of that, and of course Super7, who are doing the Reaction Plus figures, which are the O-ring figures with the standard articulation. Put that a better way, not the 5 point of articulation piece of shit figures that they have, that they put out for every other license that they have. It seems like mostly they do use the Reaction Plus line for the Universal Monsters. I think there's a Reaction Plus line for that, but and I think there's a couple Back to the Future figures that are in their Reaction Plus line, but for the most part, they just do the 5 points of articulation retro style figures, which I am not a fan of. That's why I moved away from Star Wars 2 G.I. Joe when I was a kid, was the better articulation. And that was kind of the neat thing about Visionaries, is at the time is they used the same construction design that G.I. Joe used. So the vintage ones used O-ring figures, used O-rings, and had the same articulation. The scale was a little different. We'll look at that here in a second, which may have put me off as a kid. I don't know, because I do remember seeing the Visionaries figures in the store when I was a kid, but they weren't, I don't know if they were big enough, too big for, because even as a kid, I was a scale whore. So, I mean, today, no different. Today, probably worse than I was a kid. But, maybe not. I don't know. If it didn't fit with my G.I. Joes and my Star Wars figures as a kid, I didn't have it, except for the odd piece of mask and the one Centurion figure that I had. I skipped Thundercats, He-Man, all that stuff. But they were about an inch bigger than the vintage G.I. Joe figures, but used the same construction methods. Although the screw to disassemble the chest piece is in the front instead of the back, which is kind of interesting. The Super7 figures are not vintage scale. I know that is one of the big questions that everybody's asking. So look, the big questions that everybody's asking about the Super7 figures: do they have holograms? Yes, they do. They do have holograms. Are they as good as the vintage holograms? No, they are not. That's probably, you're gonna see a lot of people probably bitch about that. I'm not going to complain about it because, number one, I have most of the vintage Visionaries figures, and most of my holograms they didn't age well. I've seen people say the only way to really get a good hologram is to get a carded figure, and of course those are really expensive. But they do have holograms on the staff and the chest piece. And what is the scale? Are they the same scale as the vintage figures? No, they are not. They are the 3 3/4 inch scaled figures. Luckily, I have a Leoric, which is the leader of the Spectral Knights. I have a vintage one and the Super7 one. And Darkstorm, I have the vintage one of him and the Super7 one of him. So we're going to look at all 4 of those together as I review the Super7 figures. I also have a couple random figures to show you that probably everyone has that particular figure or something similar to it in their collection, to show for scale, to show you just what these guys look like. But first, let's look at the packaging. As I always do in my figure reviews, I always look at 3 things: packaging, playability, and customizability. So playability or packaging, the packaging is very similar to the vintage. I've already opened them. I would have posted something sooner, but I've been really sick recently. I spent 3 days in bed. Um, and as part of my convalescence, excuse me, these showed up one day and I opened them while laying in bed because I have been waiting for these for a while. Um, so nice card art. It is the edged corners like the vintage card. Everybody's wanting to see the back of these things, of course, to see how many figures are in the wave. There's 2 figures in the wave. The file card is similar. I do have one vintage file card. It's upstairs. I should have grabbed that real quick. It is not the same as it was as the vintage one. I'm wondering if there's some licensing or trademark issues that prevent them from, because one of the big things that everybody's complaining about is the file cards originally had the spell that each character used to invoke their totem, which is not on here. And they're very, for the property, they're very iconic. And so the like diehard fans, they're pretty upset that the the invocation spell is not on the card. And I get that. I'm not too upset by that. I packaging is something that, if it's gimmicky, man, I love it. But, and I used to be a huge mint in box, mint on card collector, and I've kind of toned that down over the last few years and opened most of my carded and boxed figures to for display and to play with. So the packaging isn't as important to me now as it was, 3-4 years ago. And then a picture of Leoric and a picture of Darkstorm, and then the usual blurb from the company. So that just says to me that there's 2 figures in this particular wave. That's what they say on Super 7's site. These are available through Super 7, and Big Bad Toy Store has them for pre-order. I would assume Entertainment Earth has them for pre-order. I don't know about Amazon. I think I've seen people say that they're getting them from Amazon, but I'm not 100% on that. Don't quote me on that. But pretty much anywhere that you get your higher end, mid to higher end toys, you'll probably be able to get these. They are $25 a piece, which is the going price for Reaction Plus figures. Which, yeah, is it a little bit much? Yeah, it kind of is, but at the same time, you kind of see where that quality. This is the first Reaction Plus figures that I've bought where I feel like I got all of my money's worth on that. So, are they worth the $25 a piece? Absolutely. Is there going to be a second line? That's another big question I've been hearing. I have heard rumor, speculation around the campfire that a second wave is already planned. No names on characters. So I don't know. My guess is they're going to wait and see how well this wave 1 sells, and before they decide how much they're going to back this line. So if you have any love for this or any curiosity for this line, I would highly suggest and beg of you to go pick up a set of these for yourself to show Super 7 that there is definitely interest in this line and we want to see more of it. So that is Darkstorm's card. So there you go. Let's look at Leoric's card real quick. So the gold trim is the Darkling Lords, and the silver trim is the Spectral Knights. So this is Leoric, and he is the leader of the Spectral Knights. So that's the front of the card there. And then there's the back of the card. And there you go. So without further ado, let's get into actually looking at what you came here to see, and that is those figures. All right, here we go. So up in the front row here, going left to right, we have the vintage Leoric. I don't have any accessories for mine. I just have the loose figure. Next to him is the Super 7 Leoric. Next to him is the Super 7 Darkstorm, and then next to him is the vintage Darkstorm. Both my vintage figures seem kind of janky. They both need new O-rings. Couple of interesting points on the vintage figures. So, like I said, there is no screw hole in the back. The screw hole is underneath the hologram. And a lot of times these hologram pieces are missing from the vintage figures. What's kind of interesting is now in this day and age, if you wanted to replace these, you can probably find somebody that 3D prints these. The other interesting thing is the peg hole size on the feet is different than, so back row, we've got Super 7 Cobra, or Super 7 Serpentor, a Stormtrooper from Ahsoka, but it's the standard Stormtrooper buck. 25th anniversary Wraith, and then a 89 Battle Commander, Battle Armor Cobra Commander. So vintage G.I. Joes. You can see the peg hole is completely different size on that than it is on the vintage G.I. Joe. So here's vintage G.I. Joe compared to the Super 7 figure. So yeah, it's about a good inch bigger, inch taller. And then Super 7 figure. So yeah, same scale as the new ones are 3 3/4 inch. So it is not the same scale as the vintage, but it is the same scale as the G.I. Joe stuff. All right, and on the back, what I really like about the Super 7 figures is they have done away with this clip for the hologram. It's an integral piece to that. You can see that it's sculpted in there. That won't break off. That clip won't break, and you won't lose that piece. And they have a backpack now, which is sculpted like the vintage, similar to the vintage piece, to the back of the vintage figure. But on top of that, they have this neat little gimmick that I really like, that Darkstorm is doing right now. And we're going to demonstrate here. Is the shield, and here's the staff that it comes with, and you can kind of see the hologram on the, so that this is the Super 7 staff. I don't have a vintage Leoric staff yet, but you can see that is a hologram. And same thing with the figure. He has the lion hologram on the front of his chest there, but again, it's just the single image in the hologram. What is cool about this, if I can do it, is there is a clip on the backpack. Oops. So the resistance is a little nicer on the Leoric figure than it is on the Darkstorm figure. And the peg hole, if you're curious, the peg hole on the Super 7 figure is vintage G.I. Joe. And these are figure stands that I got from Longbow. So thanks to Troy McKee and his compatriots for providing these for me, the figure stands for me. The helmet is removable. I don't have the helmet, obviously, for the vintage one. Articulation's the same. It does not feel janky. I like the plastic they're using. It's softer than the vintage G.I. Joe stuff, but it's durable. So what does that mean? It means that you're not going to have busted thumbs 40 years down the road from that. Busted thumbs or busted crotches 40 years down the road from now, when these have been sitting on the shelf for the last 40 years. Because the plastic is soft enough that it's not going to break when you try and push your accessories into their hands, and you're not going to break heels off when you try and put them on a figure stand. So removable helmet. Face sculpt is pretty nice. I think I actually like the Super 7 face sculpt better. I think it's definitely more accurate to the cartoon than the vintage one is. So I really like that. The colors, I think there might be some fading to mine. This is the only York, the vintage one. This is the only one I have in my collection. I have a couple doubles of a couple of the other figures. So I think the colors on this one, on my vintage one, may be off from just due to age. So whether or not the color schemes are accurate to the vintage one, I'm not 100% sure, because this is my first vintage Leoric figure. So there may be some colors due to discoloration due to age. O-ring for the Super 7, not Super 7, well, the O-ring for the Super 7 figures is going to be the same one that you would use for vintage G.I. Joe. The O-rings for the vintage Super 7 figures, however, I have put standard vintage G.I. Joe O-ring sizes in mine, and it seems to be okay. It's pretty tight. I would probably go up one size on the O-rings, and I don't honestly remember what size the vintage O-rings are. There is because they're O-rings. They're you can get them in the plumbing section at Home Depot or Lowe's. And they are a specific number. I just don't remember what that number is off the top of my head. Because I don't get them there, I support smalljoes.com, and I buy my O-rings from them in a pack of 100 at a time. And then let's look at the Super 7. Sorry, I have a tremor in my hand, unfortunately. The Super 7. Darkstorm. So there you can see his hologram. I do have the vintage staff for my Darkstorm. I just didn't grab it before I started the video. His hologram on his chest is a mollusk, which there is a good backstory for that in the pilot cartoon show. And then here he is compared to the vintage one. And yeah, the vintage one is a good inch taller. How do I feel about the scale difference? As a kid, it might have bothered me that these weren't the same size as my G.I. Joe guys. But as I've gotten older and been just an enormous Iron Man fan, I think most Iron Man figures are underscaled because it's a dude in an armor. So it should be bigger than regular figures. And these are guys in armors, so they should be bigger than your standard figures. So I think actually You know, the vintage stuff scales pretty well because it's a dude in an armor. But I don't know. I do like the fact that they are the same size as my G.I. Joe figures. If these had been the same size as the vintage figures, I still would have gotten them. But the fact that they put them out in more of a 1/18 scale definitely made it more attractive to me at the beginning. But now that I've really kind of, the franchise has grown on me, I don't know that there would have been, if they had done these either way, I would have picked these up either way. I think there wouldn't have been a deal breaker on these. Let's put it that way. So here is the, and you can see there's they call that no, there's a term for the hologram when it deteriorates like that, like bleeding or something like that. But you definitely tell the hologram is much nicer on the vintage figures. But I think them not putting so much money into the holograms and making them a 3 3/4 inch probably saved an enormous amount of money, which made these a reasonable price, which is going to in turn potentially help promote the line and keep the line going because it's an affordable toy line. But I don't know. We'll see. So let's look at the Super 7 figurine. Mine does not like to hold his weapon very well. I may have to put that in his other hand. Yeah, it fits in his other hand a lot better. All right, let's do that. You're left-handed now. Oh, and then let's take his helmet off. So the head sculpt is very reminiscent of the vintage one. And again, I think the head sculpt is more in line with the, more reminiscent of the cartoon for sure than the figure was. I don't think they made, I don't remember which came first, whether it was the cartoon and then the toy line supported the cartoon or vice versa. But it all came out in 87, so it's I don't recall which one came first. But the Super 7 figures, they're definitely an homage to the cartoon. I mean, the card art, the character image for the card art on the packaging is an image from the cartoon, which I think is kind of neat. But there you go. You can see the scale and sculpt difference, and then he has the backpack that his staff clips into. And the colors on these, again, my vintage one is pushing 40 years old, so there probably is a little bit of discoloration on there. But by and by, I think the colors are pretty close to the vintage one. There is definitely a glossy sheen to the vintage one, whereas the Super 7 is more of a matte finish. I don't like it. I didn't have any of the vintage figures as a kid, so I don't remember how glossy these were. But all of these have come from collectors who have been trying very hard to sell these, so it wouldn't surprise me if they have done some restoration to these vintage figures to make them look a little bit nicer to get them sold. But I can't say for certain on that. And yeah, my vintage Dark Storm is definitely wobbly. He really needs a new O-ring. And the clip on Dark Storm is not as tight as it is on Leoric. It still works, but The one for Leoric is a little nicer, a little more tight. But there you go. There's the Super 7 Darkstorm, and then let's compare him to vintage Cobra Commander. And then a 25th anniversary G.I. Joe guy. And then kind of a standard Stormtrooper buck. And then a Super 7 G.I. Joe figure. So you can really get a appreciation for scale there. And let's give him his helmet back. All right. So there you go. That's the Super 7 first wave of the Visionaries figures. Spectral Knights Leoric and Darkling Lords Darkstorm. Top three things that I always touch on: packaging. Packaging is phenomenal. It looks just like the vintage one. Of course, it's a little smaller, just because the figure is a little smaller. Playability. These things are definitely designed to be played with. The plastic is a little softer than the vintage G.I. Joe figures, so you're not going to break thumbs off when you put accessories in their hands. Customizability. It's an O-ring G.I. Joe figure, man. I mean, this is what I started customizing on when I got into customizing, was O-ring G.I. Joe figures, because the fact that you can disassemble them so easily and take parts and bash them together and reassemble them and then paint them in any way that you want. So the customizability, of course, the hologram, you got to be careful with that, but you put a piece of painter's tape over that, take an X-Acto knife and go edge around it, and you're good. You're not going to ruin that hologram when you try and paint these things for customizability. So as far as how good of a figure this is, I think visionary purists are not going to like the fact that they are not the same scale as the vintage figures. However, I think there's going to be a wider audience now that these are G.I. Joe scale, because there's probably a ton of people out there that are like, I didn't get visionaries because they didn't scale right with my figures. Now they do. And then there's people like myself that are like, I don't really care about the scale. I just want new Visionaries figures. So I honestly, like I said, I could take it either way. If these are 3 3/4 inch scale, or if they are vintage scale. And I wouldn't have said that a couple of months ago, but the property has really grown on me over the last few months. So I'm just happy to have new Visionaries figures. I really hope this line does continue. I will definitely be picking up a second set of these to keep on the card. And I don't do that much anymore. I don't remember the last time. Well, I can't say that. I was going to say, I don't remember the last time I bought a figure just to keep it on the card. I did that with the Classified Night Viper, but that's my favorite G.I. Joe figure ever. So, and I've done that with pretty much all of the specialty Vipers in the Classified line that have come out so far. Not all of them, but most of them. So, is it a perfect figure? It's pretty close. I if I'm gonna nitpick something, it's probably going to be that the hologram on the staff is not the dual hologram that was on the vintage staff. But man, beyond that, I am really having a hard time finding anything wrong with these. I think the backpack that now holds the staff is a huge innovation and is just fucking brilliant. That is one of the biggest things that I'm having problems with right now on my vintage on displaying the vintage figures, is finding a way, because I don't want to break thumbs, so I'm really hesitant to force the staff into a 40-year-old hand. Um, is finding a way to display the staff with the figures. Plus, I'm starting to get doubles of stuff as I buy smaller, cheaper lots for specific pieces. Now I've got extra staffs. What do I do with those? I don't know. Now they clip into the figure, which, when you look at like the cartoon and the comic book, that's what they did to begin with. They stowed them on their back, so they've made them more screen accurate than the vintage figures, and the head sculpts are more screen accurate to the cartoon than the vintage figures, I think. Which, I don't know, man, like 9.8. Like I'm really having a hard time finding anything to nitpick about these figures. I like, if somebody said, tell me something that's wrong. The sculpt on the staff isn't as nice. The vintage staffs have sculpting on detailed on the back. These do not, and the sculpt on the front is not as detailed as they are compared to the vintage staffs. But beyond that, man, if you asked me to find something else wrong with these figures, I don't know that I could. So, man, yeah, these are really cool. And I said, like I said earlier in the video, I think the whole premise of technology failing and magic coming back hits harder today than it did in 1987. So I am highly anticipating seeing what Super 7 does with this line. I'm hoping to see all of the original 12 figures come out. I'm also hoping for the second unreleased second wave figures to come out. And I'm also hoping that the two female characters that were in the cartoon and comic books get figures, because they did not at any point get figures. Although there is a guy on social media that has 3D files that you can 3D print your own figures for the Spectral Knights Galadria. And I think he has the Spectral Knights female gal, and I know her name, but I can't say it right off the top of my, I don't remember right off the top of my head, and I don't want to say it wrong, but I think he has the files for both of those figures. But, they don't have holograms because nobody has ever done, I don't know that anybody does repro holograms. I know Toy Hacks does repro stickers, but they do not do repro holograms. And I don't know anybody that does repro holograms, although I haven't done a lot of research into that yet. So, should you pick these up? Yeah, I think you do. I think you should pick these up. Super 7 definitely has. I've noticed that once it's gone, that's it. And the secondary market for these tends to be pretty good. I missed the Kiss figures when they came out, and I wanted to go back and get them for the guitars for customs, and I tried to do that, and the prices were prohibitive on the secondary market because I had missed them on the initial run. And I've noticed that with pretty much all of their licenses, that if it sells out, it does pretty well on the secondary market. I don't advocate buying stuff for monetary reasons, so I never advocate buy this because it's going to be worth money in the future. I used to be like that when I first started collecting. I'm like, I'm gonna sell this for $1 million in the future. That's not the case. You can only you can only sell something for what somebody's willing to pay for it, and that's not always going to be what you want. So I don't advocate for buying these as an investment, but if you want a very nice slice of the 80s toy for a fairly reasonable price, man, yeah, this Visionaries line is it. So I would highly recommend jumping on right now, because eventually these probably, I think these will sell out. I think there's enough vintage toy collectors and customizers out there that they're going to snap these up, and this first wave will sell out, and then this line will continue. The one interesting thing is, as near as I can, as far as we can tell, is it appears to be 2 figures per wave. With the GI Joe reaction line, it's been 4 figures per wave. Um, I'm all right with the 2 figures per wave, just due to the price point. $50 for 2 figures is a bit steep, I will admit, but you know, a couple of times a year, I can afford that. That's not that's not that big of a hardship to do that. And you know, 2 or 3 years down the road, and we could have the whole first wave of these guys, and I would really like to see that. So here's hoping. Um, as always, um, thanks for watching. Please do that fun social media, like, share, subscribe, comment below. Tell me what you think about the new Super 7 Visionaries figures. Who is your favorite character in from Visionaries? Do you have any of the vintage figures? What do you like about the vintage figures? If you have accessories for the vintage figures, extra accessories for the vintage figures, hit me up, because I'm trying to complete my set. So maybe we can work out some trades or something. And what are you hoping to see from Super 7 as far as Visionaries in the future? Um, I'm also hoping to do more solo content on my YouTube channel. I'd really like to look at kind of some esoteric figures in 1/18th scale that maybe you're not as familiar with and might want in your collection at some point in time. So that's something that I'm looking at doing, is expanding kind of my solo content. And then, of course, stay tuned for General Geekery. And if you have any suggestions for tips, tricks, and tutorials that you'd like to see on action figure customizing, throw those in the comments below. I do look at the comments, and I do make videos based on suggestions. So, as always, thanks for watching.